Hello, hello, here we are, ready to read. I hope you are. Oops, I've got some noise going on somewhere. So, here we go. I have my little trusty first generation iPad mini with my story on it, ready to read to you today. Welcome. If you haven't been here before, what I do is I read old-fashioned stories for anyone who wants to listen. It doesn't have to be for kids. This particular story, it's been a very long time since I read it. It was originally written as a children's story, but probably going by modern sensibilities, it would be considered more of a young heart story, not specifically for children, because it's probably going to have some attitudes that are not modern attitudes. We'll just see how it goes. Anyway, so I'm loving seeing you all here. Sorry that some of you are in the heat at the moment. I have been hearing from several of my North American friends that it is rather warm at the moment. I have other friends over in Europe who are expecting it to be warm, but they've got thunderstorms. So I don't really know. So, Lemon, Little Princess has nearly finished being loaded over on YouTube. You'll be able to catch up with that shortly. We did finish it. Yes, we did finish it. And we have now started a new book called, well, it's an old book, but a new story called The Princess and the Goblin by George Macdonald. And I accidentally said on the first day that it was written in the 20s. It wasn't. That was one set of illustrations and one edition. This was written in the 1880s, I think. I'm not sure, but that's a bit of research. You can go and find out for yourself if you want. One of the things we've got over in the Discord, which I'm just going to put a link for those of you who are looking in chat. Sorry about that. I'm back again. I shall click in the other box and go, here we go. I'm going to put the Discord link in chat for those who haven't got it. One of the things we've now got over on Discord, if you follow that link there, you'll be able to join our Discord server, is that you can, while you're listening, draw some pictures of the things that are going in your mind from the story, but also you can see some of the illustrations from this book. I've got just a couple up there at the moment by two different illustrators, one from a very early illustration set and one from a bit later on. The slightly later one, which some of the later illustrations seem slightly unusual, interesting. Obviously the illustrator caught the feel of the story very well. They're actually the ones that I remember from the book that I grew up with, and I'm hoping one day that I can find it and show it to you, even if I just put the pictures over in Discord itself of my book. Anyway, so yes, Lemon, you have missed the rest of Little Princess, but you can catch up on what the new story is anyway, and then when Little Princess is finished being loaded on YouTube, which I shall give you a link for. I can't talk and type one-handed at the same time. You'll be able to have a listen anyway. I am editing them though so that it's just the visual of me telling you the story. It doesn't have the chat alongside it. There's not been a lot of chat, so you haven't missed a lot. Anyway, so we shall carry on. Today is only the second day we're reading The Princess and the Goblin, and we are starting at chapter 6 because some of the chapters in this book are very, very short, like 2 or 3 pages. Some of them are a lot longer. We'll see how we go. Anyway, so The Princess and the Goblin by George Macdonald, who was a Scottish gentleman, person. Chapter 6, The Little Miner, as in someone who digs mines. And I'm so glad you're here, Lemon. The next day, the great clouds still hung over the mountain. Oh, by the way, I'm getting terrible at giving you summaries. What we've had so far is a little girl who is a princess who has, for her own safety, been kept in a castle, not allowed out at night because the goblins want to end the rule of the king's family. and she is the last person in the king's family. The king's still a king, but she's the last person in the king's family that we know of so far. And so therefore his family is trying to protect her, so they have put her in a castle somewhere way out in the mountains, and that's what this story is about. Ooh, yes, silly goblins. Anyway, here we go. The Little Miner. The next day the great clouds still hung over the mountain, and the rain poured like water from a full sponge. The princess was very fond of being out of doors, and she nearly cried when she saw that the weather was no better. But the mist was not of such a dark, dingy grey. There was light in it, and as the hours went on it grew brighter and brighter, until it was almost too brilliant to look at. And late in the afternoon the sun broke out so gloriously that Irene clapped her hands, crying, "See, see, Lootie!" Irene's the princess. "The sun has had his face washed. Look how bright he is. Oh, do get my hat and let us go out for a walk." Oh dear, how happy I am." Lootie, that's her maid or nurse or carer, was very glad to please the princess. She got her hat and cloak, and they set out together for a walk up the mountain, for the road was so hard and steep that the water could not rest upon it, and it was always dry enough for walking a few minutes after the rain ceased. The clouds were rolling away in broken pieces like great over-woolly sheep, whose wool the sun had bleached till it was almost too white for the eyes to bear. Between them the sky shone with a deeper and purer blue because of the rain. The trees on the roadside were hung all over with drops which sparkled in the sun like jewels. Have you seen that, where the dewdrops or the raindrops on the edges of leaves and stuff are sparkling like jewels? They're wonderful. The only things that were no brighter for the rain were the brooks that ran down the mountain. They had changed from the clearness of crystal to a muddy brown, but what they lost in colour they gained in sound, or at least in noise, for a brook when it is swollen is not so musical as before. But Irene was in raptures with the great brown streams tumbling down everywhere, and Lootie shared in her delight, for she too had been confined to the house for 3 days. At length she observed that the sun was getting low, and said it was time to be going back. She made the remark again and again, but every time the princess begged her to go on just a little further and a little further, reminding her that it was much easier to go downhill, and saying that when they did turn they would be at home in a moment. And so on and on they did go. Now to look at a group of ferns over whose tops a stream was pouring in a watery arch, now to pick a shining stone from a rock by the wayside, now to watch the flight of some bird. Suddenly the shadow of a great mountain peak came up from behind and shot in front of them. When the nurse saw it, she started and shook, and tremulously grasping the hand of the princess, turned and began to run down the hill. "What's all the haste, nursie?" asked Irene, running alongside her. "We must not be a moment longer." "But we can't help being out a good many moments longer." It was too true. The nurse almost cried. They were much too far from home. It was against express orders to be out with the princess 1 moment after the sun was down. And they were nearly a mile up the mountain. If His Majesty Irene's papa were to hear of it, Lootie would certainly be dismissed, and to leave the princess would break her heart. It was no wonder she ran, but Irene was not in the least frightened, not knowing anything to be frightened at. They hadn't told her. She kept on chattering as well as she could, but it was not easy. Lootie, why do you run so fast? It shakes my teeth when I talk." "Then don't talk," said Lootie. But the princess went on talking. She was always saying, Look, Lootie," but Lootie paid no more heed to anything she said, only ran on. Look, Lootie, don't you see that funny man peeping over the rock?" Lootie only ran the faster. They had to pass the rock, and when they came nearer, the princess clearly saw that it was only a large fragment of the rock itself that she had mistaken for a man. Look, Lootie, there's such a curious creature at the foot of that old tree. Look at it, Lootie, it's making faces at us. I do think it is." Lootie gave a stifled cry and ran faster still, so fast that Irene's little legs could not keep up with her, and she fell with a clash. It was a hard downhill road, and she had been running very fast, so it was no wonder she began to cry. This put the nurse nearly beside herself, but all she could do was to run on the moment she got the princess on her feet again. "Who's that laughing at me?" said the princess, trying to keep in her sobs and running too fast for her grazed knees. "Nobody, child," said the nurse almost angrily, but that instant there came a burst of coarse tittering from somewhere near, and a hoarse, indistinct voice that seemed to say, "Lies, lies, lies!" "Oh!" cried the nurse with a sigh that was almost a scream, and ran on faster than ever. "Nursey, Lootie, I can't run any more. Do let us walk a bit." "What am I to do?" said the nurse. "Here, I will carry you." She caught her up, but found her much too heavy to run with, and had to set her down again. Then she looked wildly about her, gave a great cry, and said, "We've taken the wrong turning somewhere, and I don't know where we are. We are lost, lost." The terror she was in had quite bewildered her. It was true enough, they had lost the way. They had been running down into a little valley in which there was no house to be seen. Now Irene did not know what good reason there was for her nurse's terror, for the servants had all strict orders never to mention the goblins. But it was very discomposing to see her nurse in such a fright. Before, however, she had time to grow thoroughly alarmed like her. She heard the sound of whistling, and that revived her. Presently she saw a boy coming up the road from the valley to meet them. He was a whistler. Hang on. My page is going on too far. I just realised that I'm hearing something that I shouldn't be hearing. Yeah, okay, right. He was whistling. He was the whistler, but before they met, his whistling changed to singing. And this is something like what he sang. "Ring, dod, bang, go the hammers clang, hit and turn and bore, whiz and puff and roar. Thus we give the rocks, force the goblin, thus we reeve the rocks. Force the goblin locks, see the shining ore, 1, 2, 3, bright as gold can be. 4, 5, 6, shovels, mattocks, picks. 7, 8, 9, light your lamp in mine. 10, 11, 12, loosely hold the helve. We're the merry miner boys, make the goblins hold their noise." "I wish you would hold your noise," said the nurse rudely, for the very word goblin at such a time and in such a place made her tremble. It would bring the goblins upon them in a certainty, she thought, to defy them in that way. But whether the boy heard her or not, he did not stop his singing. 13, 14, 15, this is worth the sifting. 16, 17, 18, there's the match and the lating. 19, 20, goblins in a plenty. "Do be quiet," cried the nurse in a whispered shriek, but the boy, who was now close at hand, still went on. "Hush, scush, scurry, there you go in a hurry. Gobble, 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 goblin, there you go a-wobblin'. Hobble, hobble, hobblin', cobble, cobble, cobblin', hob, bob, goblin, huh." "There," said the boy, as he stood still opposite them. "There, that'll do for 'em. They can't bear singing, and they can't stand that song. They can't sing for themselves, for they have no more voice than a crow, and they don't like other people to sing." The boy was dressed in a miner's dress. That means clothes, not an actual dress. Not that it matters, but you would find it hard work to mine wearing a dress, probably. With a curious cap on his head. He was a very nice-looking boy, with eyes as dark as the mines in which he worked, and as sparkling as the crystals in their rocks. He was about 12 years old. His face was almost too pale for beauty, which came of his being so little in the open air and the sunlight, for even vegetables grown in the dark are white. But he looked happy, merry indeed, and perhaps at the thought of having routed the goblins, and his bearing as he stood before them had nothing clownish or rude about it. "I saw them," he went on, "as I came up, and I'm very glad I did. I knew they were after somebody, but I couldn't see who it was. They won't touch you as long as I'm with you." "Why, who are you?" asked the nurse, offended at the freedom with which he spoke to them. "I'm Peter's son." "Who's Peter?" "Peter the miner." "I don't know him." "I'm his son, though." "And why should the goblins mind you, pray?" "Because I don't mind them. I'm used to them." "What difference does that make?" said the nurse. "If you're not afraid of them, they're afraid of you. I'm not afraid of them, that's all. But it's all that's wanted up here, that is. It's a different thing down there. They don't always mind that song, even down there. And if anyone sings it, they stand grinning at him awfully. And if he gets frightened and misses a word or says a wrong one, don't they give it to him." "What do they do to him?" asked Irene with a trembling voice. "Don't go frightening the princess," said the nurse. "The princess?" repeated the little miner, taking off his curious cap. "I beg your pardon, but you oughtn't to be out so late. Everybody knows that's against the law." "Yes, indeed it is," said the nurse, beginning to cry again, "and I shall have to suffer for it." "What does that matter?" said the boy. "It must be your fault. It is the princess who will suffer for it." "I hope they didn't hear you call her the princess. If they did, they're sure to know her again. They're awfully sharp. In other words, they will recognise her, because you said the name, and they will recognise the face." "Lootie, Lootie," cried the princess, "take me home." "Don't go on like that," said the nurse to the boy almost fiercely. "How could I help it? I lost my way." "You shouldn't have been out so late. You wouldn't have lost your way if you hadn't been frightened," said the boy. "Come along, I'll soon set you right. Shall I carry your little highness?" "Impertinence," muttered the nurse. But she did not say it aloud, for she thought if she made him angry he might take his revenge by telling someone who belonged to the house, and then it would be sure to come to the king's ears. "No, thank you," said Irene. "I can walk very well, though I can't run so fast as Nursey. If you will give me one hand, Lootie will give me another, and then I shall get on famously." They soon had her between them, holding a hand of each. "Now let's run," said the nurse. "No, no," said the little miner. "That's the worst thing you can do. If you hadn't run before, you would not have lost your way. And if you run now, they will be after you in a moment." "I don't want to run," said Irene. "You don't think of me," said the nurse. "Yes, I do, Lootie. The boy says they won't touch us if we don't run." "Yes, but if they know at the house that I've kept you out so late, I shall be turned away, and that would break my heart." "Turned away, Lootie? Who would turn you away?" "Your papa, child." "But I'll tell him it was all my fault, and you know it was, Lootie." "He won't mind that, I'm sure he won't. He won't pay attention to that." "Then I'll cry and go down on my knees to him and beg him not to take me away, my own dear Lootie." The nurse was comforted at hearing this and said no more. They went on walking pretty fast, but taking care not to run a step. "I want to talk to you," said Irene to the little miner, "but it's so awkward. I don't know your name." "My name is Curdie, little princess." "What a funny name, Curdie. What more?" "Curdie Peterson." Remember his father was Peter. "What's your name, please?" "Irene." "What more?" "I don't know what more. What more is my name, Lootie?" "Princesses haven't got more than one name. They don't want it." "Oh, then, Curdie, you must call me just Irene, and no more." "No, indeed," the nurse said indignantly. "He shall do no such thing." "What shall he call me then, Lootie?" "Your Royal Highness." "My Royal Highness? What's that?" "No, no, Lootie, I will not be called names. I don't like them. You said to me once yourself that it's only rude children that call names, and I'm sure Curdie won't be rude. Curdie, my name's Irene." "Well, Irene," said Curdie, with a glance at the nurse which showed he enjoyed teasing her, "it's very kind of you to let me call you anything. I like your name very much." He expected the nurse to interfere again, but he soon saw that she was too frightened to speak. She was staring at something a few yards before them in the middle of the path, where it narrowed between rocks so that only one could pass at a time. No, I'm still reading. I was just taking a pause between sentences. Sorry, somebody just came into the room. "It's very much kinder of you to go out of your way to take us home," said Irene. "I'm not going out of my way yet," said Curdie. "It's on the other side of those rocks. The path turns off to my father's." "You wouldn't think of leaving us till we're safe home, I'm sure," gasped the nurse. "Of course not," said Curdie. "You dear, good, kind Curdie. I'll give you a kiss when we get home," said the princess. The nurse gave her a great pull by the hand she held, but at that instant the something in the middle of the way, which had looked like a great lump of earth brought down by the rain, began to move. One after another it shot out 4 long things, like 2 arms and 2 legs. But it was now too dark to tell what they were. The nurse began to tremble from head to foot. Irene clasped Curdie's hand yet faster, that's tighter, and Curdie began to sing again. 1, 2, hit and hew, 3, 4, blast and bore, 5, 6, there's a fix, 7, 8, hold it straight, 9, 10, hit again, hurry, scurry, bother, smother, there's a toad in the road, smash it, squash it, fry it, dry it, you're another, up and off, there's enough, ha! As he uttered the last words, Curdie let go his hold of his companion and rushed at the thing in the road as if he would trample it under his feet. It gave a great spring and ran straight up one of the rocks like a huge spider. Curdie turned back laughing and took Irene's hand again. She grasped his very tight, but said nothing till they had passed the rocks. A few yards more and she found herself on a part of the road she knew and was able to speak again. "Now, do you know, Curdie, I don't quite like your song. It sounds to me rather rude," she said. "Well, perhaps it is," answered Curdie. "I never thought of that. It's a way we have. We do it because they don't like it." "Who don't like it?" "The cobs, as we call them." "Don't," said the nurse. "Why not?" said Curdie. "I beg you won't. Please don't." "Oh, if you ask me that way, of course I won't, though I don't know why. Know why. Look, there are the lights of your great house down below. You'll be home in 5 minutes now." Nothing more happened. They reached the home in safety. Nobody had missed them or even known they had gone out. And they arrived at the door belonging to their part of the house without anyone seeing them. The nurse was rushing in with a hurried and not over-gracious good night to Curdie, but the princess pulled her hand from hers and was just throwing her arms around Curdie's neck when she caught her again and dragged her away. "Lootie, Lootie, I promised Curdie a kiss," said Irene. "A princess mustn't give kisses. It's not at all proper," said Lootie. "But I promised," said the princess. "There is no occasion. He is only a minor boy. He's a good boy and a brave boy, and he has been very kind to us." "Lootie, Lootie, I promised." "Then you shouldn't have promised." "Lootie, I promised him a kiss." "Your Royal Highness," said Lootie, suddenly growing very respectful, "must come in directly." "Nurse, a princess must not break her word," said Irene, drawing herself up and standing stock still. Lootie did not know what the king might count the worst, to let the princess be out after sunset, or to let her kiss a minor boy. She did not know that, being a gentleman, as many kings have been, he would have counted neither of them the worse. However much he might have disliked his daughter to kiss the minor boy, he would not have had her break her word for all the goblins in creation. But as I say, the nurse was not lady enough to understand this, and so she was in a great difficulty, for if she insisted, someone might hear the princess cry and run to see, and then all would come out. But here Curdie came again to the rescue. "Never mind, Princess Irene," he said. "You mustn't kiss me tonight, but you shan't break your word. I will come another time. You may be sure I will." "Oh, thank you, Curdie," said the princess, and stopped crying. "Good night, Irene. Good night, Lootie," said Curdie, and turned and was out of sight in a moment. "I should like to see him," muttered the nurse. "I should like to see him," muttered the nurse, as she carried the princess to the nursery. "You will see him," said Irene. "You may be sure Curdie will keep his word. He's sure to come again." "I should like to see him," repeated the nurse, and said no more. She did not want to open a new cause of strife with the princess by saying more plainly what she meant. Glad enough that she had succeeded both in getting home unseen and in keeping the princess from kissing the miner's boy, she resolved to watch her far better in future. Her carelessness had already doubled the danger she was in. Previously, the goblins were her only fear. Now she had to protect her charge from Curdie as well. That's the end of that chapter, and we shall have chapter 7 shortly. Have you got your drink of water? Sorry, my nose is tickly. Inside, not outside. Just because the way I was eating earlier. Lemon, have you tried taking the protection cover off the back of your phone? It will help it to cool down. Maybe. Or blow gently on it to cool it down. Hopefully your phone is actually going to stay going for you and that you haven't had to drop out. That would be such a disappointment. I hope you're enjoying this story. It's just different, isn't it? It's what they call a Victorian, because it was written in Victorian times. It's a Victorian fantasy. And when the author was asked if it was a fairy story, he said no, because there are no fairies in it. That's why we call it a fantasy rather than a fairy story. So, are you ready? Did you have your drink of water? Have you been to the loo? I have another mouthful since I'm doing all the talking, and I'll need it. So I'm just going to put in some information in the chat for those of you who might have arrived late. So that will be Discord. So if you, hang on, that's wrong. Ooh, no, wrong one, wrong button. So if you would like to join us so you can chat about the stories we've been reading or make suggestions for other ones that you'd like to hear, then you can join us over on our Discord server, which I've just put the information in the chat for you. If you are watching this on YouTube, there will be links to these to Discord over there for you, so you can come and join too. And I shall put, for those of you who are watching this on Twitch, I shall give you my YouTube link so that if you really want to, you can catch up on old stories that we've previously read, which are now housed over on YouTube because Twitch only keeps them for 2 weeks. So there you go. And you're most welcome to sign into Twitch and talk in the chat over there while we're here listening to the story. And during chapters, I will probably not read your chat. I shall read the story, but you can chat with the others in chat together. So there you go. I shall carry on reading with chapter 7, which is called The Mines. Now, our previous chapter was The Little Miner. Oopsie, I hit the wrong button then. I went to library instead of chapters. Bother. Chapter 7, that means that was chapter 6. Chapter 6 had 26 pages. That's quite a long one. Some books, the chapters are all similar lengths. Other books, they are all very different. So that was 26 pages, and the next chapter is 8 pages. So that's quite a lot of variety there. So we shall carry on. Chapter 7 of The Princess and the Goblin by George Macdonald, and this one is called The Mines. Curdie went home whistling. He resolved to say nothing about the princess for fear of getting the nurse into trouble, for while he enjoyed teasing her because of her absurdity, he was careful not to do her any harm. He saw no more of the goblins, and was soon fast asleep in his bed. He woke in the middle of the night, and though he heard thought he heard curious noises outside, he sat up and listened, then got up and, opening the door very quietly, went out. When he peeped round the corner, he saw under his own window a group of stumpy creatures, whom he at once recognised by their shape. Hardly, however, had he begun his 1, 2, 3, when they broke asunder, scurried away, and were out of sight. He returned laughing, got into bed again, and was fast asleep in a moment. Reflecting a little over the matter in the morning, he came to the conclusion that as nothing of the kind had ever happened before, they must be annoyed with him for interfering to protect the princess. By the time he was dressed, however, he was thinking of something quite different, for he did not value the enmity of the goblins in the least. As soon as they had had breakfast, he set off with his father for the mine. They entered the hill by a natural opening under a huge rock where a little stream rushed out. They followed its course for a few yards, when the passage took a turn and sloped steeply into the heart of the hill, with many angles and windings and branchings off, and sometimes with steps where it came upon a natural gulf. It led them deep into the hill before they arrived at the place where they were at present digging out the precious ore. This was of various kinds, for the mountain was very rich with the better sorts of metals. With flint and steel and tinderbox they lighted their lamps, then fixed them on their heads, and were soon hard at work with their pickaxes and shovels and hammers. Father and son were at work near each other, but not in the same gang, that's the work group, the passages out of which the ore was dug. Not in the same gang. The passages out of which the ore was dug they called gangs, for when the lode or vein of ore was small, one miner would have to dig away alone in a passage no bigger than gave him just room to work, sometimes in uncomfortable, cramped positions. If they stopped for a moment, they could hear everywhere around them, some nearer, some farther off, the sound of their companions, burrowing away in all directions in the inside of the great mountain, some boring holes in the rock in order to blow it up with gunpowder, others shovelling the broken ore into baskets to be carried away to the mouth of the mine, others hitting away with their pickaxes. Sometimes, if the miner was in a very lonely part, he would only hear a tapping no louder than that of a woodpecker, for the sound would come from a great distance off through the solid mountain rock. The work was very hard at best, for it was very warm underground, but it was not particularly unpleasant, and some of the miners, when they wanted to earn a little more money for a particular purpose, would stop behind the rest and work all night. But you could not tell night from day down there, except from feeling tired and sleepy, for no light of the sun ever came into those gloomy regions. Some who had thus remained behind during the night, although certain there were none of their companions at work, would declare the next morning that they heard, every time they halted for a moment to take a breath, a tapping all about them, as if the mountain were then more full of miners than ever it was during the day, and some in consequence would never stay overnight, for all knew those were the sounds of the goblins. They worked only at night, for the miner's light was the goblin's day. Miner's night was the goblin's day. Indeed, the greater number of the miners were afraid of the goblins, for there were strange stories well known among them of the treatment some had received whom the goblins had surprised at their work during the night. The more courageous of them, however, amongst them Peter Peterson and Curdy, who in this took after his father, had stayed in the mine all night again and again, and although they had several times encountered a few stray goblins, had never yet failed in driving them away. As I have indicated already, the chief defence against them was verse, for they hated verse of every kind, and some kinds they could not endure at all. I suspect they could not make any themselves, and that was why they disliked it so much. At all events, those who were most afraid of them were those who could neither make verses themselves nor remember the verses that other people made for them. while those who were never afraid were those who could make verses for themselves, for although there were certain old rhymes which were very effectual, yet it was well known that a new rhyme, if of the right sort, was even more distasteful to them, and therefore more effectual in putting them to flight. Perhaps my readers may be wondering what the goblins could be about, working all night long, seeing they never carried up the ore and sold it. But when I have informed them concerning what Curdie learned the very next night, they will be able to understand, they being the readers. Yeah, now I've got an itchy nose. That's one of my usual things, isn't it? I'm just trying to get the hair to stop it itching me too. For Curdie had determined, if his father would permit him, to remain there alone this night, and that for two reasons. First, he wanted to get extra wages in order that he might buy a very warm red petticoat for his mother, who had begun to complain of the cold on the mountain air sooner than usual this autumn. And second, he had just a faint glimmering of hope of finding out what the goblins were about under his window the night before. When he told his father, he made no objection, for he had great confidence in his boy's courage and resources. "I'm sorry I can't stay with you," said Peter, "but I want to go and pay the parson a visit this evening, and besides, I've had a bit of a headache all day." "I am sorry for that, father," said Curdie. "Oh, it's not much. You'll be sure to take care of yourself, won't you?" Curdie was the only one who remained in the mine. About 6 o'clock, the rest went away, everyone bidding him good night and telling him to take care of himself, for he was a great favourite with them all. "Don't forget your rhymes," said one. "No, no," answered Curdie. "It's no matter if he does," said another, "for he'll only have to make a new one." "Yes, but he mightn't be able to make it fast enough," said another, "and while it was cooking in his head they might take a mean advantage and set upon him." "I'll do my best," said Curdie. "I'm not afraid." "We all know that," they returned, and left him. And that's the end of that chapter. I said some of them are short. I have a quick drink because I've got a tickle in my throat now. So here we go. We are going to carry on with chapter 8, which is called The Goblins. The Goblins. Chapter 8 of The Princess and the Goblin by George Macdonald. The Goblins. For some time Curdie worked away briskly, throwing all the ore he had disengaged on one side behind him, to be ready for carrying out in the morning. He heard a good deal of goblin tapping, but it all sounded far away in the hill, and he paid it little heed. Toward midnight he began to feel rather hungry, so he dropped his pickaxe, got a lump of bread which in the morning he had laid in a damp hole in the rock, to stop it going stale, sat down on a heap of ore and ate his supper. Then he leaned back for 5 minutes' rest before beginning his work again, and laid his head against the rock. He had not kept the position for 1 minute before he heard something which made him sharpen his ears. It sounded like a voice inside the rock. After a while he heard it again. It was a goblin voice, there could be no doubt about that, and this time he could make out the words. "Hadn't we better be moving?" it said. A rougher and deeper voice replied, "There's no hurry. That wretched little mole won't be through tonight. If he work ever so hard, he's by no means at the thinnest place." "But you still think the load does come through into our house?" said the first voice. "Yes, but he's a good bit further on than he has got to yet. If he had struck a stroke more to the side, just here," said the goblin, tapping the very stone, as it seemed to Curdie, against which his head lay, "he would have been through, but he's a couple of yards past it now, and if he follow the load it'll be a week before it leads him in. You see it back there, a long way. Still, perhaps in case of accident it would be as well to be getting out of this. Helfer, you take the great chest. That's your business, you know." Yes, Dad, said a third voice, but you must help me get it on my back. It's awfully heavy, you know. Well, it isn't just a bag of smoke, I admit, but you're as strong as a mountain, Helfer. You say so, Dad. I think myself that I'm all right, but I could carry 10 times as much if it wasn't for my feet. That is your weak point, I confess, my boy. Ain't it yours too, Father? Well, to be honest, it is a goblin weakness. Why they come so soft, I declare I haven't an idea. Especially when your head's so hard, you know, Father. Yes, my boy, the goblin's glory is in his head. To think how the fellows up above there have to put on helmets and things when they go fighting. Ha ha! But why don't we wear shoes like them, Father? I should like it, especially when I've got a chest like that on my head. That's the chest he was carrying. Well, you see, it's not the fashion. The king never wears shoes. The queen does? Yes, but that's for distinction. The first queen, you see, I meant the king's first wife, wore shoes, of course, because she came from upstairs, and so when she died the next queen would not be inferior to her, as she called it, and would wear shoes too. It was all pride. She's the hardest in forbidding them to the rest of the women. I wouldn't wear them. No, not for that I wouldn't, said the first voice, which was evidently that of the mother of the family. I can't think why either of them should. Didn't I tell you the first was from upstairs, said the other. That was the only silly thing I ever knew His Majesty guilty of. Why should he marry an outlandish woman like that, one of our natural enemies too? I suppose he fell in love with her. Pah! He's just as happy now with one of his own people. Did she die very soon? They didn't tease her to death, did they? Oh dear, no. The king worshipped her very footmarks. What made her die then? Didn't the heir agree with her? She died when the young prince was born. How silly of her. We should never do that. It must have been because she wore shoes. I don't know that. Why do they wear shoes up there? Ah, now that's a sensible question. I will answer it. But in order to do so, I must first tell you a secret. I once saw the Queen's feet. Without her shoes? Yes, without her shoes. No, did you? How was it? Never you mind how it was. She didn't know I saw them, and what do you think? She had toes. Toes? What's that? You may well ask. I should never have known if I had not seen the Queen's feet. Just imagine. The ends of her feet were split up into 5 or 6 thin pieces. Oh, horrid! How could the king have fallen in love with her? You forget that she wore shoes. That is just why she wore them. That is why all the men and women too upstairs wear shoes. They can't bear the sight of their own feet without 'em. Ah, now I understand. If ever you wish for shoes again, Helfer, I'll hit your feet, I will. No, no, mother, pray don't. Then don't you. But with such a big box on my head. A horrid scream followed, which Curdie interpreted as in reply to a blow from his mother upon the feet of her eldest goblin. Well, I never knew so much before, remarked a fourth voice. Your knowledge is not universal quite yet, said the father. You were only 50 last month. Mind you see to the bed and bedding. As soon as we've finished our supper, we'll be up and going. Ha, ha, ha. What are you laughing at, husband? I'm laughing to think what a mess the miners'll find themselves in somewhere before this day 10 years. Why, what do you mean? Oh, nothing. Oh, yes, you do mean something. You always do mean something. It's more than you do then, wife. That may be, but it's not more than I find out, you know. Ha, ha, you're a sharp one. What a mother you've got, Helfer. Yes, father. Well, I suppose I must tell you. They're all at the palace. consulting about it tonight, and as soon as we've got away from this thin place, I'm going there to hear what they might fix upon. I should like to see that young ruffian there on the other side struggling in the agonies of—" He dropped his voice so low that Curdie could hear only a growl. The growl went on in a low bass for a good while, as inarticulate as if the goblin's tongue had been a sausage, and it was not until his wife spoke again that it rose to its former pitch. "But what shall we do when you are at the palace?" she asked. "I will see you safe in the new house I've been digging for you the last 2 months. Podge, you mind the table and chairs. I commit them to your care. The table has 7 legs, each chair 3. I shall require them all at your hands." After this arose a confused conversation about the various household goods and their transport, and Curdie heard nothing more that was of any importance. He now knew that at least one of the reasons for the constant sound of the goblin hammers and pickaxes at night, they were making new houses for themselves to which they might retreat when the miners should threaten to break into their dwellings. But he had learned 2 things of far greater importance. The first was that some grievous calamity was preparing, and almost ready to fall upon the heads of the miners. The second was the one weak point of a goblin's body. He had not known that their feet were so tender, as he had now reason to suspect. He had heard it said that they had no toes. He had never had opportunity of inspecting them closely enough in the dusk in which they always appeared, to satisfy himself whether it was a correct report. Indeed, he had not been able even to satisfy himself as to whether they had no fingers, although that was also commonly said to be the fact. One of the miners, indeed, who had had more schooling than the rest, was wont to argue that such must have been the primordial condition of humanity, and that education and handicraft had developed both toes and fingers, with which proposition Curdie had once heard his father sarcastically agree, alleging in support of it the probability that babies' gloves were a traditional remnant of the old state of things, while the stockings of all ages, no regard being paid in them to toes, pointed in the same direction. So, because we put mittens on babies so they don't scratch themselves sometimes, and then socks on our feet. But what was of importance was the fact concerning the softness of the goblin feet, which he foresaw might be useful to all miners. What he had to do in the meantime, however, was to discover, if possible, the special evil design the goblins had now in their heads. Although he knew all the gangs and all the natural galleries with which they communicated in the mined part of the mountain, he had not the least idea where the palace of the king of the gnomes was. Goblins. Otherwise he would have set out at once on the enterprise of discovering what the said design was. He judged, and rightly, that it must lie in a further part of the mountain, between which and the mine there was as yet no communication. There must be one nearly completed, however, for it could be but a thin partition which now separated them. If only he could get through in time to follow the goblins as they retreated. A few blows would doubtless be sufficient, just where his ear now lay, but if he attempted to strike there with his pickaxe, he would only hasten the departure of the family, put them on their guard, and perhaps lose their involuntary guidance. He therefore began to feel the wall with his hands, and soon found that some of the stones were loose enough to be drawn out with little noise. Laying hold of a large one with both his hands, he drew it gently out and let it down softly. "What was that noise?" said the goblin father. Curdie blew out his light, lest it should shine through. "It must be that one miner that stayed behind the rest," said the mother. "No, he's been gone a good while. I haven't heard a blow for an hour. Besides, it wasn't like that." "Then I suppose it must have been a stone carried down the brook inside." "Perhaps. It will have more room by and by." Curdie kept quite still. After a little while, hearing nothing but the sounds of their preparations for departure, mingled with an occasional word of direction, and anxious to know whether the removal of the stone had made an opening into the goblin's house, he put in his hand to feel. It went in a good way, and then came in contact with something soft. He had but a moment to feel it over. It was so quickly withdrawn. It was one of the toeless goblin feet. The owner of it gave a cry of fright. "What's the matter, Helfer?" asked his mother. "A beast came out of the wall and licked my foot." "Nonsense, there are no wild beasts in our country," said his father. "But it was, father, I felt it." "Nonsense, I say. Will you malign your native realms and reduce them to a level with the country upstairs? That is swarming with wild beasts of every description." "But I felt it, father." "I tell you to hold your tongue. You are no patriot." Curdie suppressed his laughter and lay still as a mouse, but no stiller. For every moment he kept nibbling away with his fingers at the edges of the hole. He was slowly making it bigger, for here the rock had been very much shattered with the blasting. There seemed to be a good many in the family, to judge from the mass of confused talk which now and then came through the hole. But when all were speaking together, and just as if they had bottle brushes, each, at least one, in their throats, it was not easy to make out much that was said. At length he heard once more what the father goblin was saying. "Now then," he said, "get your bundles on your backs. Here, Helfer, I'll help you up with your chest." "I wish it was my chest, father." "Your turn will come in good time enough. Make haste. I must go to the meeting at the palace tonight. When that's over we can come back and clear out the last of the things before our enemies return in the morning. Now light your torches and come along. What a distinction it is to provide our own light instead of being dependent on a thing hung up in the air, a most disagreeable contrivance, intended no doubt to blind us when we venture out under its baleful influence. Quite glaring and vulgar, I call it, though no doubt useful to poor creatures who haven't the wit to make light for themselves." Curdie could hardly keep himself from calling through to know whether they made the fire to light their torches by. But a moment's reflection showed him that they would have said they did, inasmuch as they struck two stones together, and the fire came. And that's the end of that chapter, which was chapter 8. Another drink of water. Come on, get your water. Oh, this is very interesting. So we haven't found out much about the goblins before now, and suddenly all of it's about the goblins. Oh my goodness. So what do you think's going to happen? Ooh. The Princess and the Goblin by George Macdonald. Chapter 9. The Hall of the Goblin Palace. A sound of many soft feet followed, but soon ceased. Then Curdie flew at the hole like a tiger and tore and pulled. Remember, he wants to keep up with them so he can find out where to go. The sides gave way, and it was soon large enough for him to crawl through. He would not betray himself by rekindling his lamp, but the torches of the retreating company, departing in a straight line up a long avenue from the door of their cave, threw back light enough to afford him a glance round the deserted home of the goblins. To his surprise, he could discover nothing to distinguish it from an ordinary cave in the rock, upon many of which he had come with the rest of the miners in the progress of their excavations. They're probably old goblin homes. The goblins had talked of coming back for the rest of their household gear. He saw nothing which would have made him suspect a family had taken shelter there for a single night. The floor was rough and stony, the walls full of projecting corners, the roof in one place 20 feet high, in another endangering his forehead, while on one side a stream, no thicker than a needle, it is true, but still sufficient to spread a wide dampness over the wall, flowed down the face of the rock. But the troop in front of him was toiling under heavy burdens. He could distinguish Helfer now and then in the flickering light and shade, with his heavy chest on his bending shoulders, while the second brother was almost buried in what looked like a great feather bed. Where do they get the feathers? Thought Curdie. But in a moment the troop disappeared at a turn of the way, and it was now both safe and necessary for Curdie to follow them, lest they should be rounding the next turning before he saw them again, for so he might lose them altogether. He darted after them like a greyhound. When he reached the corner and looked cautiously round, he saw them again at some distance, down another long passage. None of the galleries he saw that night bore signs of the work of man, or of goblin either. Stalactites far older than the mines hung from their roofs, and their floors were rough with boulders and large round stones, showing that there water must have once run. He waited again at this corner till they had disappeared round the next, and so followed them a long way through one passage after another. The passages grew more and more lofty, and were more and more covered in the roof with shining stalactites. It was a strange enough procession which he followed, but the strangest part of it was the household animals which crowded amongst the feet of the goblins. It was true they had no wild animals down there, but at least they did not know of any, but they had a wonderful number of tame ones. I must, however, reserve any contributions towards the natural history of these for a later position in my story. At length, turning a corner too abruptly, he had almost rushed into the middle of the goblin family, for there they had already set down all their burdens on the floor of a cave considerably larger than that which they had left. There they were as yet too breathless to speak, else he would have had warning of their arrest, their stopping. He started back, however, before anyone saw him, and retreated a good way, still watching till the father should come out to go to the palace. Before very long both he and his son Helfer appeared, and kept on in the same direction as before, while Curdie followed them again with renewed precaution. For a long time he heard no sound except something like the rush of a river inside the rock, but at length what seemed the far-off noise of great shouting reached his ears, which, however, presently ceased. After advancing a good way further, he thought he heard a single voice. It sounded clearer and clearer as he went on, until at last he could almost distinguish the words. In a moment or two, keeping after the goblins round another corner, he once more started back, this time in amazement. He was at the entrance of a magnificent cavern of an oval shape, once probably a huge natural reservoir of water, now the great palace hall of the goblins. It rose to a tremendous height, but the roof was composed of such shining materials, and the multitudes of torches carried by the goblins who crowded the floor lighted up the place so brilliantly that Curdie could see to the top quite well. But he had no idea how immense the place was until his eyes got accustomed to it, which was not for a good many minutes. The rough projections on the walls and the shadows thrown upward from them by the torches made the sides of the chamber look as if they were crowded with statues upon brackets and pedestals, reaching in irregular tiers from floor to roof. The walls themselves were in many parts of gloriously shining substances, some of them gorgeously coloured besides, which powerfully contrasted with the shadows. Curdie could not help wondering whether his rhymes would be of any use against such a multitude of goblins as filled the floor of the hall, and indeed felt considerably tempted to begin his shout of 1, 2, 3, but as there was no reason for routing them, and much for endeavouring to discover their designs, he kept himself perfectly quiet, and peeping round the edge of the doorway, listened with both his sharp ears. At the other end of the hall, high above the heads of the multitude, was a terrace-like ledge of considerable height, caused by the receding of the upper part of the cavern wall. Upon this sat the king and his court, the king on a throne hollowed out of a huge block of green copper ore, and his court upon lower seats around it. The king had been making a speech, and the applause which followed it was what Curdie had heard. One of the court was now addressing the multitude. What he heard him say was to the following effect. Hence it appears that two plans have been for some time together working in the strong head of his Majesty for the deliverance of his people. regardless of the fact that we were the first possessors of the regions they now inhabit, regardless equally of the fact that we abandoned that region from the loftiest motives, regardless also of the self-evident fact that we excel them as far in mental ability as they excel us in stature, they look upon us as a degraded race and make a mockery of all our finer feelings. But the time has almost arrived when, thanks to His Majesty's inventive genius, it will be in our power to take a thorough revenge upon them, once for all, in respect of their unfriendly behaviour. "May it please your Majesty," cried a voice close by the door, which Curdie recognised as that of the goblin he had followed. "Who is he that interrupts the Chancellor?" cried another from near the throne. "Glump," answered several voices. "He is our trusty subject," said the king himself in a slow and stately voice. "Let him come forward and speak." A lane was parted through the crowd, and Glump, having ascended the platform and bowed to the king, spoke as follows. "Sire, I would have held my peace had I not known that I only knew how near was the moment to which the Chancellor had just referred. In all probability, before another day is past, the enemy will have broken through into my house, the partition between being even now not more than a foot in thickness." "Not quite so much," thought Curdie to himself. "This very evening I have had to remove my household effects. Therefore, the sooner we are ready to carry out the plan for the execution of which His Majesty has been making such magnificent preparations, the better. I may just add that within the last few days I have perceived a small outbreak in my dining room, which, combined with observations upon the course of the river escaping where the evil men enter, has convinced me that close to the spot must lie a deep gulf in its channel. This discovery will, I trust, add considerably to the otherwise immense forces at His Majesty's disposal." He ceased, and the king graciously acknowledged his speech with a bend of his head, whereupon Glump, after a bow to His Majesty, slid down among the rest of the undistinguished multitude. Then the Chancellor rose and resumed. "The information which the worthy Glump has given us," he said, "might have been of considerable import at the present moment, but for that other design already referred to, which naturally takes precedence. His Majesty, unwilling to proceed to extremities, and well aware that such measures sooner or later result in violent reactions, has excogitated a more fundamental and comprehensive measure, of which I need say no more. Should His Majesty be successful, as who dares to doubt, then a peace, all to the advantage of the Goblin kingdom, will be established for a generation at least, rendered absolutely secure by the pledge which His Royal Highness the Prince will have and hold for the good behaviour of his relatives. Should His Majesty fail, which who shall even dare to imagine in his most secret thoughts, then will be the time for carrying out with rigour the design to which Glump referred, and for which our preparations are even now all but complete. The failure of the former will render the latter imperative." Curdie perceived that the assembly was drawing to a close, and that there was little chance of either plan being more fully discovered, now thought it prudent to make his escape, before the goblins began to disperse, and slipped quietly away. He doesn't want them wandering around finding him. There was not much danger of meeting any goblins, for all the men at least were left behind him in the palace, but there was considerable danger of his taking a wrong turning, for he had now no light, and had therefore to depend upon his memory and his hands. After he had left behind him the glow that issued from the door of Glump's new abode, he was utterly without guide, so far as his eyes were concerned. He was most anxious to get back through the hole before the goblins should return to fetch the remains of their furniture, but it was not that he was in the least afraid of them, but as it was of the utmost importance that he should thoroughly discover what the plans they were cherishing were. He must not occasion the slightest suspicion that they were watched by a miner. He hurried on, feeling his way along the walls of rock. Had he not been very courageous, he must have been very anxious, for he would not but for he could not but know that if he lost his way it would be the most difficult thing in the world to find it again. Morning would bring no light into these regions, and toward him least of all, who was known as a special rhymester and persecutor, could goblins be expected to exercise courtesy? Well might he wish that he had brought his lamp and tinderbox with him, of which he had not thought when he crept so eagerly after the goblins. He wished it all the more when, after a while, he found his way blocked up and could get no further. It was of no use to turn back, for he had not the least idea where he had begun to go wrong. Mechanically, however, he kept feeling about the walls that hemmed him in. His hand came upon a place where a tiny stream of water was running down the face of a rock. "What a stupid I am," he said to himself. "I am actually at the end of my journey. And there are the goblins coming back to fetch their things," he added, as the red glimmer of their torches appeared at the end of the long avenue that led up to the cave. In a moment he had thrown himself on the floor and wriggled backward through the hole. The floor on the other side was several feet lower, which made it easier to get back. It was all he could do to lift the largest stone he had taken out of the hole, but he did manage to shove it in again. He sat down on the ore heap and thought. He was pretty sure that the latter plan of the goblins was to inundate the mine by breaking outlets for the water accumulated in the natural reservoirs of the mountain, as well as running through portions of it, while the part hollowed by the miners remained shut off from that inhabited by the goblins. They had had no opportunity of injuring them thus, but now that a passage was broken through, and the goblins' part proved the higher in the mountain, it was clear to Curdie that the mine could be destroyed in an hour. Water was always the chief danger to which the miners were exposed. They met with a little choke damp sometimes, but never with the explosive fire damp, so common in coal mines. Hence they were careful as soon as they saw any appearance of water. Choke damp might be gas, I'm not sure. As the result of his reflections, while the goblins were busy in their old home, it seemed to Curdie that it would be best to build up the whole of this gang, filling it with stone and clay or lime, so that there should be no smallest channel for the water to get into. There was not, however, any immediate danger, for the execution of the goblins' plan was contingent upon the failure of that unknown design which was to take precedence of it. And he was most anxious to keep the door of communication open, that he might if possible discover what that former plan was. At the same time they could not then resume their intermitted labours for the inundation without his finding it out, when by putting all hands to the work the one existing outlet might in a single night be rendered impenetrable to any weight of water. For by filling the gang entirely up, their embankment would be buttressed by the sides of the mountain itself. As soon as he found that the goblins had again retired, he lighted his lamp and proceeded to fill the hole he had made with such stones as he could withdraw when he pleased. He then thought it better, as he might have occasion to be up a good many nights after this, to go home and have some sleep. How pleasant the night air felt upon the outside of the mountain after he had gone through in the inside of it. He hurried away up the hill without meeting a single goblin on the way, and called and tapped at the window until he woke his father, who soon rose and let him in. He told him the whole story, and just as he had expected, his father thought it best to work that load no further, but at the same time to pretend occasionally to be at work there still, in order that the goblins might have no suspicions. Both father and son then went to bed and slept soundly until morning. And that's the end of the chapter 9. And I am not reading any more today because it's 4:10. So there you go, the princess and the goblin. So now we've met the goblins. Oh my, they don't sound like they have some nice things in store. They sound like they have some not very nice things in store. And what do you think the king's alternate plan is? Thinking about the things that they have said have been part of the Goblin royal family past, and the fear that we heard in one of the previous chapters, what do you think their plans might be? Oh well, I'm going to one more time give you the Discord link so you can come over and join our Discord, and once you are there you can discuss this with the rest of us. You can see some of the pictures, and I will find the picture. There was one picture in today's chapter in the version that I'm reading from that I will post for you, and I will see if the other illustrations I have any more pictures from today's chapters, so you'll be able to see those as well. And what else? Is there anything else? So you can join our Discord anyway, and you can draw pictures of what you think it looks like. Yes, it's really dark in the middle of the night, but you know what I mean, in the middle of the mountain. So there's Discord, and here's YouTube if you want to catch up on previous stories that you missed out on. So have a look in the chat. There it is. And don't forget, if you haven't already, follow me here. And that means that you will get notified when I go live on Twitch, so you can come and join in and listen to more stories. And also, if you follow me, if you subscribe to my channel over on YouTube, you will get notified when stories get posted over there. So, as I've said previously, but you might have missed it, the stories that we've done before, because they only stay here for 2 weeks, I take them and I put them up over on YouTube, but I edit them so they don't have the chat frame around them for the newer ones, and then they can stay there for as long as we want, and you can listen to them again and again. We have Millie Molly Mandy, we have The Wind in the Willows, we have Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, we have Through the Looking Glass, we have A Little Princess, we have The Secret Garden. There might be something else, I can't remember. Anyway, so we're building up a nice collection of old-fashioned stories that you can go and have a listen to. See you there. Please join us. Bye.